Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
So welcome to season 3. What are we? Episode 6 of Inside the Rookery, and welcome to a very special guest, Johan Egerkrans, who is here to talk about his life's work, doodling and folklore.
Thank you.
We're really happy to have you here, Johan. So welcome to the stream.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
As always, we've had loads of questions pre-submitted by Patreons and by the folks on our Discord server, and we'll get through as many of them as we can. I've got Graeme Davis here, I've got Mark Gibbons here. We're all really excited to talk to you today, and I'll let you introduce yourself for a minute or so, as little as much as you like, or we can just dive into the questions.
All right. Usually this takes like 10 minutes because I start rambling. I'm Johan Egerkrans. I'm a Swedish illustrator and writer, and I started up as a concept artist for computer games, and then I slowly sort of sauntered into children's books and made my debut as a writer. Debuted. Do you say debuted? Debuted, sorry. In 2013 with Vaesen, or Nordiska Vaesen as it was called back then in Swedish. So I write a sort of illustrated fact books, pop science books, richly illustrated about stuff I like, which is the same stuff that I liked when I was about 11.
Yes.
It's myth and folklore and dinosaurs.
Nice.
That's all life, all interesting life.
That's like everything useful there.
It's
Like,
all
why would you want any
That's
more?
what you need to know. That's basically what I do these days. I think that's it.
Well, welcome to the show, and I will just jump us right into the first questions. So this has come from Will, who asks, when creating works around folklore, how do you serve the old and the new? What's the dynamic between tradition and new invention, and how do you adapt the old for a new audience or new work?
I think when I started, when I made Vaesen, one of the things was my back then editor Maya wanted me to write a book, and initially we were thinking about something like something like Harry Potter or something like that, fiction, and I started to realize I'm much more invested in something I'm already invested in. It's hard for me to be invested in something I make up.
Right.
And I think I'm more suited to do books where I try to make the reader love something I love as much as I do, so to speak. But that sort of comes from an initial love for the subject. For me, it's much more about trying to present the old and really try to stick to the original myth or the original lore, or whatever you call it. Same with dinosaurs, basically. But it's lore, but it's more scientific lore. But I really try to do something that it's an engaging Wikipedia article, basically. And then the new comes in my visual representation of it. But I try to refrain from adding too much fiction to it. It's really just my my take on a subject. But I really try to stay close to the sources, as close as possible, and try to remain true to the old, so to speak, or the myth. Or whatever it is I'm writing about.
Do you find sometimes that you try to stay true to like the folkloric subject you're illustrating, but it's just too bonkers?
Well, yeah, sometimes that happens a lot actually. That's another thing. You always have to sort of juggle. You have to juggle two things. There's a reason why you like vampires and werewolves for a reason, and that comes from popular culture. And then when you start researching Swedish folklore about werewolves, you realize that they're often three-legged, because a human has 4 extremities, and they think the one of the human legs turns into the tail, so they can't have 4 legs.
Right.
So werewolves are 3-legged and with a tail, and that's stupid.
Yeah.
Right.
So
Yeah.
I didn't draw it like that. But now thinking about it, maybe that's exactly what I should have done. But that's sort of those kind of things. Sometimes there's a clash between what actually made you like, say, vampires, and then you have to sort of marry the sort of gothic version of, especially when it comes to these horror creatures, that you have to sort of you want to play on the gothicness of it. You want to play on the trope, but you still want to remain true to the folklore, and that's always a sort of it's always a juggling act. And then
I was thinking, Graeme. Sorry, of the Nucklevy, the one that you described without any skin on.
That's so crazy, and of course it's it's particularly with Celtic lore. There's this tradition of exaggeration, and it's just you can do that in words, and that's fine. You can say whatever you want, but when you try to draw or model it based on those words, it gets a little difficult, I'm sure.
Yeah, especially I'm not like a psychedelic or
quite.
I'm not Salvador Dali. No, I mean sometimes it's just when it gets too weird. That's or like one of these Japanese manga artists that are just so good at doing skewed, weird stuff, and my sensibilities don't really work that way. Or like a fellow Games Workshop illustrator like Adrian Smith is really good, especially his old stuff. So weird. And I don't really have that sensibility. I'm a bit more cookie cutter in a way.
I mean, I feel the same way. It's a sort of a need to, even with the most fantastical creatures, ground them in some sort of reality. You know what I mean? Despite of how strange and odd and peculiar it might be. Some of the folkloric creatures, you read the description, and well, if I paint this as written, it loses any sort of menace or any kind. It just becomes ridiculous and cartoon almost, and you kind of like, well, I want to rein that back.
They just become silly, or
The other thing I've found,
sometimes it's just sort of clashes with your own sensibilities, and then it's so like with the Nucklevy, there's several interpretations, and one of them is that I mean, the Nucklevy is a sort of sea demon, and it's like a skinned rider fused to his horse, basically, its horse, with long arms. And there's one tradition where the horse has a horse head, and then the rider is sort of fused into the back of the horse. But there's another sort of centaur version as well,
right?
The centaur version, because that's easier for me to pull off.
Sure. And that's the thing about folklore, is that there's no canon for folklore, and the stories so often have different details, contradict each other, particularly when you, as you said, dealing with things like vampires and werewolves, where there's so much out there over so many centuries. So as a writer, I find that, I just have to pick the details that work best for me.
Yeah, you have to pick and choose. And I really realized that when I did the Undead a few years ago, just looking at Romanian vampires, there's different vampire lore in every village, basically, it seems like.
Right.
You really have to, in the end, you have to pick and choose what you like, or what you like to enhance, at least, and then there's always room for different interpretations. But
sea goat says it's not a horse, it's a sea goat. Kilishandra has asked, what's your favorite media to illustrate with?
It's the good old pencil. I always start with pencil sketches. So pencil on paper with an eraser. That's all you need to do an illustration. And then I used to do stuff when I started out, because I'm old now. But we didn't have pen tablets and Photoshop when I grew up. So I did everything with for real, so to speak, with aquarels. And I painted actually when I started my career as an illustrator. I painted a lot with Games Workshop paints, or at least the old Games Workshop paints.
They're pretty good. The coverage is pretty good on them, and the opacity was really good, as opposed to some.
Yeah, and you can paint rather small because you can paint with a small brush, and they're so fine. The fine grains, so you can sort of fit everything into an A4 paper. So they were perfect. But nowadays I do pencil sketches, and then I bring it into the computer and finish off everything in Photoshop. So I paint everything in Photoshop. But I use a lot of watercolor textures that I've done. I got a sort of a file with lots of color textures. It's
very, very similar to what I do as well, but I'm always struggling to find those good texts. Do you create your own?
I just have a field day when I just slap.
Right, yeah.
And then I scan it all.
Me too. And I found I made loads initially, and I've ended up with just 3 that I use all the time.
Yeah, there's like 5.
Yeah.
And then there's some I've downloaded from the internet, but they're usually quite low res. So, and then I created a lot of custom brushes in Photoshop as well, like snapper brushes and stuff like that. So, but really, I tried to make it look
that's
real, so to speak.
You have to invest when you go digital, you have to invest so much effort to make it look traditional, whereas traditional, it's just traditional. And now you go digital. Okay, how can I recreate the stuff that came so naturally in the real world? Now I've got to synthesize it in Photoshop. And for me recently, I've like yourself, I would always start with pencil and on paper, but I've moved entirely digital to help me with sort of old aging thumbs. So you don't have to, because you can control the pressure that you use with the tablet. So my battle recently has been finding really, really good pencil brushes that replicate pencil on paper for me. I've eventually found some that are pretty close. And once you start slapping color and texture on it, it's hard to tell it's not actual pencil. But it just
I often tweak my pencil sketches once they're in the computer.
Oh yeah, I would do that all the time. Yeah.
But I still want the pencil.
Me too, really. I feel like it's a loss. Yeah, but and again, just having that physical art is a big deal at the end of the day as well.
The tactility of it—it's so important.
Yeah.
Here's one from Andy. I don't know which Andy. There's a lot of them about. Is there a creature from folklore you really want to illustrate but you haven't managed to yet? And Graeme and Mark, you can obviously answer that too. And Graeme, you can answer about one you'd like to write about. But we'll go to our guest first, as always.
I mean, there's so many of them. When I did research for the undead, I had a book with 1,000 different vampires from all over the world, and I ended up with 30. So there's always stuff you want to draw. I'm struggling to. I mean, I always love to draw monsters. I mean, I'd like to do at some point like a classical bestiary, just do all the classical monsters. And I think we'll probably get into that later on. But if I do. I want to do a Greek book at some point. There's some Greek stories in my new book, Dragons, but I'd like to do a proper Greek mythology book. But I've been reading up on Greek mythology, and it's all a bit rapey. It's very
yes,
all of it. Yeah.
Yep.
So I'm not really interested in doing the Zeus rape stuff.
Zeus takes a form of another animal.
Yeah, 50% of the stories are just that, and that's not very interesting. I think.
No.
So if I do it, I'm probably gonna focus on the monsters and the heroes, because that's much more interesting and a lot less rapey, even if it's
quite so. Yeah.
Like even Medusa though, like even when you get into the heroes in Medusa was a really wronged woman, but she still got her head chopped off. Like
I have a podcast in Swedish on Spotify where we did the Medusa story, and it's pretty grim. But any number of sirens, like they're just there minding their own business, having a bit of a sing. It's like it's not on them.
Nope.
All on those sailors. Yeah. I say that as someone who named my child after a siren, so I'm firmly on the siren side.
Horny sailors.
That's right. Yeah, you get to a stage where a manatee looks pretty good, and you think that's a mermaid.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
I
have swam with wild manatee, and at no point did I mistake them for a mermaid.
At no point did you sexually assault them.
That's
good to know.
No. Clearly, you'd not been at sea long enough.
It's a manatee. Anyway, but that's but just doing the classical, not doing in the painting the classical monsters. I'm really looking forward to do that.
Very nice.
At some point, like the Manticore and all those.
What was this? This isn't a pre-submitted question, but it just struck me as interesting because for me, actually, the first myths and folklore I encountered were Greek and Roman myths and folklore. Myths, really, just because of the way, I don't know why. It's really weird that you don't encounter your own folklore first. Was that the same for you, or did you encounter Swedish, Scandinavian folklore first before you encountered, others?
Think basically the same. I grew up with both. When I was a kid on Swedish television, they had a lot of folklore was quite big in Sweden. It feels like. I mean, I guess it was in Britain as well with fairies and all that. There was a sort of wave after the 70s. So when you grew up in the 80s, there was a lot of interest in folklore and myth. And in Sweden on television, we had shows. We had advent calendars on Christmas. So every day before Christmas, the 24 days before Christmas, there was one episode of that sort of calendar on TV, and one of them was called "The Heroes and Monsters on the Night Sky." If I just do a quick translation, so it was about the stories behind the constellations. So that was obviously Greek folklore, and the church didn't like that.
For an advent calendar show, a bold choice.
But then they had another one with a very Swedish, a very famous Swedish folklorist called Ebbe Schön, who also looks like Santa Claus, so it's like perfect TV. It's really cool. He's still alive. He's like 94 now, but it is like the granddaddy of folklore in Sweden. And he hosted another advent calendar, another year. And then they brought up a lot of Swedish folklore creatures and myths. And then you were always surrounded with the Norse mythology. So I mean, I grew up on Greek mythology and Norse mythology, but it feels like they all both had the sort of the same weight to them. Because so I think I grew up on both, but it's obviously it's Greek and Norse mythology that's sort of closest to my heart, and I think they're the two most popular globally.
Oh, definitely.
There's a sense of humor to them. They're easy to connect to. I mean, the Greeks are so insightful psychologically, and the North myths are just so fucking cool. Like a better word. But I mean, they're dreamy and absurd in a different way, but there's so much humor to them, and there's a sort of flair to them that I think most people find fascinating, and combined with the darkness, and that's really what I like about them. They're very modern in that way. So I grew up on both those.
On both, yeah.
I'm repeating myself now. So.
No, that's great. Susan Henry Yukimi asks, what is and what isn't a fable? Which is interesting because when I think of fables, I think of Aesop's fables. I think of like classic myth, classic fables. So what is and what isn't a fable, and what is and what isn't folklore?
Yeah, for me, I mean, we got the same word in Swedish, fabel. For me, a fable is about it's a moral lesson involving animals that behave as humans, anthropomorphic animals. That's a fable. And folklore. Folklore is it's stories that have been traded as truth. I mean, they're urban myths from days of old, basically, but it's the same thing.
Right.
It's stories that have been traded between people, often something that sort of happened to someone that someone else knew, someone's brother's cousin encountered something in the woods.
Yeah, exactly.
Heard about a girl who had a serial killer sleeping under her bed and licking her hand. You know that old story with humans can lick as well. It's the same sort of thing. It's urban myth or folklore. That's the same thing. So it's two different kinds of stories. Fables are sort of made up stories intended as more lessons, and folklore is just sort of our way of, and it's our way of making sense of the world around us. Because stuff happens, and people are really, we as humans are hyper social animals, so we have a big problem sort of realizing that stuff just happens because
it has to be God's will.
It has to be a reason.
Happens for a reason. Everything happens. There's an agent behind it. There's some sort of agency when something happens. When the milk goes sour, it's not just because it went sour. It's because someone made it go sour, and then you.
Betty Pixies.
Maybe it was a witch, or maybe it was something else.
Yeah.
But there's always an agent behind stuff that happens because that's just the way we're wired. And folklore helps sort of, and conspiracy theories. Often they sort of help.
Exactly. From the same need.
I hadn't considered that. Conspiracy theories are modern folklore. Yeah, almost.
Yeah, modern day fairy tales. Yeah,
it's conspiracy theory.
It's the same thing. No, we have a real problem with just accepting that shit happens.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's where that comes from, I think.
Which is lucky though, because it's given you loads of great stuff to draw.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, and we're really good at coming up with cool.
Yeah.
Especially people back in the days were even better at coming up with interesting solutions.
Yeah.
Yes, before science came along and messed with everything. Yeah.
I mean, I'd still like to do a book about aliens. I mean, that's also folklore. I mean, people who look almost like humans but not quite, and come from another world close to ours and kidnap people. That could be trolls.
Parallel dimensions, and
but it's the same type of story.
Definitely.
So I think you've given us a bit of a hinter on this one, right? You've given us a bit of a hint with your thousands and thousands of vampires, but Seagoat has asked, how much research, if any, do you put into taking folklore, fable, or just a campfire story that's always retold and adapting it for the tabletop or a book?
Well, to begin with, I mean, I don't write the role-playing games. I leave that to Nils and Graeme. But for my own books, I do research for the big books like Vaesen or The Undead or Dragons. I do research for every book takes about 2 years to make, 2.5. They take longer and longer because I start pushing the deadline. I'm starting to be like Douglas Adams. I love deadlines. I love the whooshing noise they make as they go by.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
But a big part of it is first year is basically research, or at least half a year. I just read lots of books on the subject and try to sort of get a hang of how the myths. Sorry for my pronunciation. The myths are right. That'll try to get a feel for the subject basically, and try to get a lay of the land, and then I might start. I sort of write all the books as articles. So I start with just somewhere in the middle. I make a list of all the all the creatures or animals if I write about dinosaurs and paleontology. Then I start to pick out the ones I'm most interested in, and then I start somewhere in the middle with one that sort of strikes my fancy, and then I write that article, which is a page or 1.5 pages, and then I draw it, and then I go back and find something else, and then I edit the list, and so I try to, I got a list of stuff I want to write about, and then I sort of go through that list, and in the end I do the introduction when I do that last usually, because that's when I've had the most time to think about everything, how everything sort of fits together. So it's a very strange process.
Do you ever start with the art? Is there an image you have in your head, and then I'll write it out after I've got the picture down?
Usually it's informed by the story, so I have to do the research first. But sometimes I just draw something I like, sort of just out of my head, and find somewhere it fits
to fit it in.
But usually it's informed. Usually it's I write first and write first and ask questions later. I write first and draw later, and then in the end I do like half of all the drawings in a book when the deadline comes.
Yeah,
knocking on your door. I think when I did Norse Gods, I think there's like 100 illustrations, and I worked on it for 3 years. That was the hardest book to make because I had so much pressure. I felt so much pressure getting it right, and I think I did half the illustrations first 3 years, and then the other 50 in the last 2 months.
Yeah. It sounds about right.
It does.
Mark nods knowingly.
Yeah.
What about you, Graeme? You've done more of the writing and taking a lot of folklore and turning it into different versions. How do you go about it, researching?
Well, I mean, I started back in like 19. And I did I was playing D&D, running D&D, and I wanted new monsters to throw at my players, so I just started reading folklore books because all the mythology monsters had been taken. They were already statted. I couldn't surprise anybody with them because my players had already memorized all the rules. So I started reading folklore, and I've never stopped. So I guess I have put a lot of research into it, but normally I don't have to do a great deal of research for a particular project. I just have to revisit my sources, refresh my memory, and depending on the game system or the slant of an article or whatever I'm writing for, there'll be certain things that I'll see when I refresh my memory, and it's like, oh yeah, that's cool. That would make a nice little rule within this game system, or that's something that's kind of been forgotten in the popular image of this creature. So it'd be nice to refresh that or bring it forward as an option, and that sort of thing. Other than that, it's pretty much the same process as Johan described, only without the drawing. I make a list. I spend some time lamenting that there isn't room for all of them. I cut it down. I cut it down again. I cut it down again. and then I look at, you know, how the information is to be presented within usually I'm working for an existing game, so they have a particular format for how they describe their creatures. And I see if I can squeeze in anything more. Like I always like to add some adventure seeds so you can see the creature in action, see how it works, stuff like that. And then, yeah, I just try to take the information from the sources, make it as accessible as I can, make it give the best gameplay and the best options for gameplay that I can, and write it up in my very best words.
The best one.
I'm going to go on to this one because I think it leads on quite nicely, Graeme, from what you were just saying there. So whether used as inspiration or for material or otherwise, what benefits and drawbacks do Fables and Folklore come with for writers, game designers, readers, and players?
Oh, yeah. Well, in my experience of trying to make fantasy from folklore is dominated by a creature that I created for Warhammer called the Fimir. And that was, yeah, exactly. I got so enchanted by the fact that, I can create a new fantasy monster out of folklore elements that will subliminally sound like it's really rich and has a deep background, but I just made it up today because these folklore elements all kind of trigger something in the human mind. So it just feels right. And I did that a little too uncritically. And I got, let this be a cautionary tale for everybody who's doing something similar. I got, one of the things I did was there was I think it was an Orkney creature called a Kunnal Troll, probably a kind of troll that came over with the Norse in the 10th, 12th centuries, which was specified as being only male. And I looped this back into the whole fairy abduction motif, you know, the fair maidens being seduced by fairy lords and all the rest of it, you know. And I did not stop to think that what I was talking about here was basically kidnapping and rape and forced breeding. And when the thing came out, other people did notice. And I've been embarrassed by it ever since. So I would say there are many elements that are and can be very useful, both in terms of gameplay and in ticking all the right psychological boxes to be satisfying on the same way that classic fantasy and folklore is. But they need to be used with care. Because, modern sensibilities are different. And actually a lot of folklore and fairy lore is incredibly dark. It's just that in the 19th century, the writers kind of glossed over that. And you have to be careful.
Yeah, I mean, classic fairy tales are extremely dark. I mean, it's not that hard to sort of imagine what Little Red Riding Hood is about, really.
Right.
Think about it. And they're extremely brutal. I mean, they became sort of sanitized later on in the late century, but the original stories are pretty horrendous.
Yeah, I had occasion to read the complete Brothers Grimm, unexpurgated, for a project that never happened. And there are things like Cinderella's evil stepmother is punished by being fitted with a pair of red-hot iron shoes and made to dance until she died.
Until she dies, yeah. And there's quite a few of those, like the millstone one.
Of the eyes of the
That's right. Yeah.
It's incredibly violent.
There's a millstone one where like a stepmother feeds the miller like his son as sausages, and then in the end like the millstone goes round her neck and that's how she's murdered. And it is truly like, when you read them, they are truly horrific.
Yes,
like,
not the Disney versions that we've been.
No, not at all.
And a lot of forced marriage for like, Bluebeard and all the castles where like you can't go into that room, and if you go into that room then you find like the corpses of all the other wives. You're just like, this is really quite grim, actually. No pun intended.
No.
No, but I mean, but I mean, it is, I mean, folk horror. That's why, like folk horror, because it is dark and there's something primeval about it. But I think, I mean, just as a side discussion, going back to Warhammer, I think that drew me to Warhammer and Warhammer 40K when I was a kid. Especially like that when Eldar came out in the early 90s, and there was a lot of they were presented in an old White Dwarf article in White Dwarf.
I remember that one.
And there were short stories of their myths about the gods. And they were so well written, and they were so informed by.
Well, thank you. That was me.
That was you, yeah. Because it's so apparent that they were informed by old Middle Eastern myths. Like there's a lot of echoes about what was it called? Like Babylonian myths, Marduk, and all that stuff, and Egyptian mythology. But they had the same ring to it and the same sort of dreamlike logic, and it's so well done, and that's really drawn me in. I really like it.
Well,
that's what I like about Warhammer. There's a proper, it used to be a proper, it's so mythical in its truest sense.
Well, I think, first Jez and I sat down probably for about a week and hammered all that stuff out. And he had a lot of the ideas already in his head. And it was a great project to work on. But one of the things that sort of separates Warhammer from, the D&D as D&D was when Warhammer came out, was that a lot of people, for some reason, at Games Workshop had a background in history, on archaeology, and so on. I guess because a lot of Games Workshop's heritage came through Citadel miniatures, so war gamers are obviously historians, at least in part. That Warhammer was informed a lot by his actual history and mythology. Whereas D&D was informed mostly by Hollywood.
Yeah, and that's why I never liked D&D, because it's that sort of.
It didn't feel real. Didn't feel real.
No, it's too clean. The morality is too simple. Yeah, and
when we were writing for Wifrip and when on 4th edition, like your point right at the start, Johan, really resonated with me about like you had to feel like invested in it, and it had to feel like something, not that you were, going into Harry Potter or someone else's world, but it was your world. And that's always how Warhammer felt to me, because we'd played it for so long, we'd read so much about it, we'd lived in that world, we'd played for literally years in that world. And when I came to write stuff, I was writing down like memories and things that someone I knew, various characters had been through, and that made it like really rich. And I think that's, for me, Warhammer has always felt like richer and more layered in terms of its mythology and folklore than, say, D&D has. And I do love the Eldar too, like their whole, the echoes of the Eldar, and then back into the elves, and then backwards and forwards. I just think is
it's beautiful,
controversial but beautiful.
And there's a tragedy to them as well. No, there's something. I think it appeals. I mean, it's a European thing. I mean, we live in history in a different way. I mean, there's like castles.
I mean, I think that's also to the fact that
ruins and. I don't live in Rome, where we start to get annoyed after a while when you try to walk there and there's a ruin or an excavation. But still, I mean, I live in Stockholm. It's been around for 700-800 years or something like that. Every time they try to dig up a new street, they find something, some old building at least 500-600 years old. You're surrounded by history in a different way. And then something like Warhammer resonates more with you. There's also this sort of dark, cynical humor.
I think not to dump on D&D. It is very much a difference. It's because it was an American creation where there isn't that richness of history. That isn't that sense of Eldar, like sort of like races in decline, as many of us Europeans feel these days. You don't draw on that rich history, so it is more of a blank canvas because that's what America always is, and it's part of the appeal of the US. You can build your own legend in this country, for better or worse.
Maybe this was what the medieval times were like.
Maybe, okay.
Go with it.
Right. We'll take a side route because we talked about Eldar and 40k. So, as a miniature game, are you more pulled to fantasy or sci-fi?
As a writer and illustrator, I usually end up in some sort of fantasy camp. I've sort of been labeled as a fantasy illustrator, I think, because I do myths and they sort of it's more old timey. But I really like science fiction, and I love Warhammer 40k because then you get all of it. It's medieval and
right,
time, and that's what I really like about it. I love to do. I did a few years ago. I did some illustrations for Osprey for a miniature game called Rogue Stars, I think. What's it called? I think Rogue Stars, which was set in a sort of hive of scum and villainy, very sort of Star Warsy, very Mos Eisley-esque, with space pirates and all that stuff. And it was so much fun to do because I'd drawn swords and forests for so long, so I got to draw robots and cyborgs and aliens, and it was. I love that stuff as well, and I rarely get to flex those muscles. So at some point, I want to do an alien book or a book about spaceships or something, just to do something new. But for me, 40k is perfect because it combines fantasy and science fiction in the coolest way possible.
Yeah, me too. Really, if I'm gonna kit bash a bunch of miniatures of my inquisitorial warband, then I want to be able to mix those two, the dark fantasy and the crumbling science fiction. You
can have just a medieval guy with a sword next to a space marine in a
I still wear that Dark Angel t-shirt to bed, so I know that's weird, Martin, but it is what it is.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, one of the things I really love about Johan's miniatures is that it's rare to see a traditional artist who paints miniatures like they're his painting. So every time I see one of your miniatures, I know it's one of yours because it's got exactly the same sort of texture and color palette and rendering as your artwork does. So it's a delight anytime you post a freshly painted miniature. I'm always
thank you.
To see your stuff.
It's a lot of people have said that. I never thought about it myself, but I do. I mean, obviously, you have this sort of way of putting paint to paper or paint to miniature that's the same. So it will. I sometimes I sort of reflect on that. Hey, how can someone else sculpted this head?
Right.
But now it looks like one of my paintings. So
Yeah.
But it's not. I mean, but yeah, it sort of carries through. It's strange. But thank you.
A question from.
I think that's a compliment.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a question that's coming in the chat. So, what advice would you give for any American gamers who've fallen in love with Vaesen? Should we become Scandinavian history buffs? Well,
Yeah.
obviously you should
It's not intended as a way of slanging off Americans. It's more. It's a different mindset, I think. That the things we talked about previously. I don't know. Graeme, do you have any? I think. I mean, obviously, you have to if you're gonna play in gonna play in Scandinavia in the 1800s. You need to do a bit of research, just like you do when you play in Lord of the Rings or any system, any role-playing game becomes better the more you know about the world, and it doesn't really matter if it's actual history or the sort of made-up history, but you always have to do research on the lore. And in this case, it's quite easy. You can just read a book about Scandinavia in the 1800s. There should be a few around, I think. Most of them probably in Swedish and Norwegian or Danish, but there's going to be some in English. But
there are.
At the same time, it wasn't that different from America in the 1800s, because everybody who lived there, apart from the Native Americans, came from Europe. Mm-hmm. So I mean, in Sweden in 1850 wasn't that different from Wisconsin in 1850, because it was the same people who lived there. It was Swedes who moved over there, and so I mean it's I mean American culture basically made up of Europeans in a way. I mean, at least when it was founded. Obviously not anymore, but I mean it's not that different as you think. That's sort of my point.
Same themes of industrialization, increased stratification of society, those tensions, and the nice juxtaposition of the new industry and the new science with the old beliefs. And you know, a Swedish folklore didn't grow up in a vacuum. It's part of a whole continuum. There are echoes of it in Scotland and in northern England. A lot of the creatures will be familiar to you if you know anything about folklore and fairy lore under different names, but they'll behave very, very similarly.
And it's all part of a sort of Indo-European mythical system. If you look at it in an even broader sense, mythologies are quite similar, and all of Thunder God and all of them, you know, it's all connected. And I mean, take a movie like The Witch, for instance, New England folk tale. I mean, it's set in New England, but it could just as well be set in Scotland.
England.
I mean, England, exactly.
In old England, or
Anyway, about the amount of sort of background or research that gamers or players would do. Is there a risk that you become too knowledgeable about the potential adventures you might find yourself on as a player, and you end up sort of having godlike knowledge of a situation that you then have to rein back when you're playing the game, so you're not you don't know too much?
I mean, it's always about making up a good story. I mean, the story is more important than facts, and that's sort of one of the points with Vaesen. I mean, we never say specifically when it's set. It's set in the 1800s in Scandinavia, but we don't say it's. And I mean, in our minds, it's sort of set in middle 1850, 1860. But you can mix and match, and you can move around, and it doesn't matter. Oh, that king wasn't.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, who cares? That's not the point.
Exactly. Yeah. That's
loose with the history. It's a world on its own. It's not the actual 18th century or 19th century. Sorry, that always confuses me.
Me too. Yeah.
I think I've observed from watching what people ask about in terms of Wifrup, in terms of other systems, they want the answer, and there isn't actually the answer. So what is the answer about what a troll is? What is the answer about where there isn't an answer. There is layers and layers and layers. And that's what folklore is. It's layers and layers and layers of overlapping local tales that have been told from parent to child, from round campfires, round, fires in houses, and have changed over time. But you can see the mirrors in them of that universal human experience. And that's why I've always loved like role-playing games that are based on things like that, because there isn't an answer. It's not as simple as like, well, when was that person born? When did that kingdom? Well, yeah, who knows?
Yeah. It's not science. I mean,
it's not science. Yeah,
it's the quickest way to take the fun out of it. It's
really,
I mean, you have to take an almost movie maker's approach to history, historical detail, in that you're trying to create more of a feeling, an emotion, an impression with the setting, rather than saying, well, this is the year 1852 where these things happened in history, and we're, which you can do if you like, but you have to be very careful, or it just becomes a boring history lesson instead of a fun game.
Yeah, and the same thing with I think mythological creatures, or something like if you're playing in a Lovecraftian adventure, and everybody's so familiar with the Cthulhu mythos, is you don't want your players instantly recognizing the creature you present in front of them. Oh, well, I know how this behaves. I know what this character does. I know how to deal with it. You kind of, as the GM, you feel you need to be able to undercut that sort of expectation. Throw some curveballs at your players, so keeping them kind of on their toes, regardless of how much lore they've actually absorbed themselves.
And that's a thing. That's one of the things I really like about the Vaesen. About the Free League's game system, that the creatures don't have stats, because in most other game systems, if you look into, say, Dungeons and Dragons, what they call the sort of, there's a book about mythology where they have all the gods, basically. So
that's right.
You look up Cthulhu or Zeus, and he's like, okay, so he's got size 30, and he's got 100 strength, and he's got this and that, and you see all the stats, and that lessens the mythological being when you can't you can't define them. They're undefinable. They're unfathomable. That's sort of the point with them. And I like that aspect of the game system in Vaesen, that the creatures don't have stats. They are undefinable. They're more like they're natural forces.
Mm-hmm. Right. It's time for a quickfire round, because we don't have long. I've got loads of questions. So quickfire, first thing that comes into your head. Andy has asked, which folkloric creature do you think is most instinctually, viscerally terrifying, and why?
I got some time to think about that. I think of the ones I've illustrated and dealt with, most of them are going to end up doing the undead book about undead, and I think it's the Manananggal from the Philippines.
Oh, the head separates.
Yeah, that's I think the Penanangal.
Oh, Penanangal, sorry, yeah.
But Manananggal, they're sort of vampires. They often work as midwives, and then at night the upper body separates from the lower body, so the legs sort of stand around in the cot. And then they sprout wings on the back, and they fly away with all these sort of entrails just sort of trailing behind them. And then they suck the blood out of fetuses, like with a sort of a long proboscis tongue through so they're
unpleasant.
That's fairly terrifying. Yeah,
that's pretty terrifying. Really for me, it's the washerwoman, because I read about her at a young age, and she's just an old lady at a ford washing her clothes. But if she slaps you in the leg, then you die. And I actually have a novel where that happens to one of the characters who has the second sight, except he's the Gallic character. And I just, like, even thinking about it actually makes me really quite unnerved.
Is that a Bane Sid or no?
Sort of. So
Benya.
Benya. Yeah.
I'm going to say the Mary Lloyd, which is a character from Welsh folklore, who is so terrifying because she will come to your house, beat you in a rap battle, and then drink all your booze. It's just alarming.
Yeah. Not what you want. Yeah, I have to say the Knuckle of V, because it is just so bizarre, and it breathes plague, and it very almost impossible to kill, and it's
Just the look of it, that sort of Hellraiser blade skin. And
very much Hellraiser. Yeah, and all it's the way it can, wilt crops with its breath. It can kill animals with its breath. It just spreads plague all around it. It's just completely bad news.
The sea goat asks, the three billy goat scruff is obviously the best fairy tale out there. Discuss. I did look it up. You were right. It's the Tre Bukene Bruser. It's Norwegian, and thus, in my perspective, clearly makes it the best. But in seriousness, I didn't actually realize how many fairy tales that I thought were Grimm, Germanic fairy tales, are actually Scandinavian tales that are Asbjornsen and Moe collected, Hans Christian Andersen developed, until I started learning Norwegian and actually started to source Norwegian books and stuff.
But they're probably both, because they pop up all over. I mean, these stories travel. I mean, there's a Sami, like in northern Sweden and northern Scandinavia, the Sami have a story about two brothers that sneak into a giant's cave to steal his goats or sheep, which is exactly the same story as Polyphemus in the Odyssey. It's the same story. Yeah. It's not one-eyed, the giant, but apart from that, it's very extremely similar, and so somehow that story traveled up to the north of Scandinavia, which isn't that strange, because I mean Homerus wrote it in 2,500 years ago, so it's had some time. But it might also be that story might be 1,000 years old here, and the original story is 5,000 years old or 10,000 years old, or something like that. I mean, these stories pop up all the time. There's a commonality of themes and sort of plot lines.
I think it was a Scandinavian, I can't remember his name, but it's like two people did it, then one person developed it, and it's the 3-letter acronym for classifying all fairy tales. You might know it, Graeme. It's like ETA or something.
Yeah, I don't know what it's called, but I've seen it in books. Yeah,
it's really useful because it does exactly that. It says this is this is an animal like a wolf gets a fox or something, and it just goes through them, and they've gone round the world and just classified them all. So on that note, in terms of 3,000 years old, what are some of the oldest sources or stories you've drawn on, and what are some of the most modern additions to folklore that you're into?
Well, I think the oldest must be from dragons that I recently came up with, because there I sort of delve into a bit of Egyptian mythology and Babylonian mythology, Sumerian mythology, and they're at least 5,000 years old, 6. So they're pretty darn old. There's a few mentions of vampiric lore in the undead as well that dates from Babylonia. So, what was the follow-up question? I don't remember. It's sort of
what are the newest ones?
What are the newest? Well, I haven't gotten to that, I think. I mean, if we talk about Vaesen, I mean, those tales are fairly recent. When they were collected, in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Most of them. So I mean, they're the sort of late versions, just before the sort of rural farmer society went away for good. It's sort of the last gasp of that period. So that's when they were collected. But those stories evolved and they were collected. There was a late versions of them that were collected.
Because you can see the mix, can't you? In some of the Scandinavian stories, like the Snow Queen or like the Little Match Girl, there's direct reference to her immortal soul, to God. Like there's the crossover between the old folklore and that newer, which then of course it wasn't new in the 19th century, but it was new in the tales by then.
What I understand is still that's I mean, those are literary fairy tales. I mean, they're
not collected.
They're made up, so to speak. They're fictional fairy tales.
There's
a difference between those sort of in Swedish we call them. Yeah, it doesn't matter. But there's a difference between collected, traded fairy tales and artistic fairy tales, or whatever you call it. There's a proper term for it in English, but I don't remember it.
You mean like the traditional versus the commercially published?
Well, Hans Christian Andersen made them, like some of them were based on fairy tales, but some of them he just straight up made up as I'm going to write a fairy tale today. It was a creation of them.
I see, basically in the same way as Graeme made up new Eldar myths based, but because you're so well informed, you read so much about ancient mythology that you could sort of make something that has the same themes and sort of feel to it, but it's still a new made up story.
It's sort of like kit bashing.
Sorry?
Sort of like kit bashing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I'm afraid we've come to the end of our hour. We'd have talked for like ever on, Graeme and me can always talk about folklore.
It's true.
And Johan and Mark, and that's us. We could be in here all night. But thank you so much. Sorry I didn't get to all your questions. We did get through quite a lot of the pre-submitted ones.
Yeah,
so that's always a win.
I hope I made some sort of semblance of...
You absolutely did.
Absolutely did, yeah.
We've put Johan's website is in the comments. I've been checking it out.
Go buy Johan's book.
Yeah, go buy Johan's book.
Yes. Get them all.
Some of my friends have been asking me to make some orders for them when I do my order, and we'll get a whole shipment and save on postage. It'll be great. So yeah, please.
Lovely.
Yeah, looking forward to perhaps hopefully meet some of you, especially you, Graeme, on some sort of convention or something when Vaesen.
Yes.
I'm so looking forward to see that in print.
Yes, me too.
And the rest of you,
very much.
We never met. It would be...
That's right. Yeah. It was all by email, wasn't it? Our collaboration. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming. It's been a pleasure to meet you. And as ever, to our viewers, thank you. To our patrons, thanks for supporting us. Check out our Patreon if you would like to, and like and follow us on YouTube. And until next week, have an amazing evening. Thanks, everyone. See you all soon.
Bye all.
Bye.
So long.